You are listening to the IFH Podcast Network. For more amazing filmmaking and screenwriting podcasts, just go to ifhpodcastnetwork.com.
Welcome to Filmmaking Conversations with Damien Swaby. Listen to conversations with award-winning filmmakers, directors from the golden age of television, and creatives from the indie film community who continue to inspire the next generation of filmmakers. And now, over to your host, Damien Swaby.
Welcome to Filmmaking Conversations with me, your host, Damien Swaby, the podcast where insights meets inspiration in the world of film. Today on the podcast, I'm joined by Maggie Mahrt, who is not just a filmmaker, she's a cinematic alchemist who transforms raw emotion into captivating screen stories. From World War II narratives such as Say It German to the creative shifts needed across various forms of media, Maggie will share her compass for navigating the vast terrain of filmmaking. This ride with Maggie Mahrt will take us through the peaks and valleys of a relentless pursuit of storytelling excellence. Maggie, how are you today?
Good, Damien. Thanks for having me. How are you?
No, I'm fine. Thank you. I'm over the moon. You're on the podcast. We're doing it. We're going to have a great podcast. And I'm happy that you have decided to come on. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Anytime. And Maggie, I've wondered since watching some of your work. I've been on your Vimeo channel and obviously other places to see all the stuff that you've done. Mm-hmm. Your storytelling often includes a blend of humor and deep emotional narratives. How do you strike that balance and ensure that one does not overshadow the other in your films?
Yeah. For me, I think, the script is always going to be the true north. That's where I go to get my marching orders. It's always going back to story. So it really is about interpreting the story in a way that seems honest. And sometimes that means more humor. Sometimes, it's more serious. It really just depends on the story. And so I always go back to the script. I'm not trying to impose something from the outside. I'm trying to discover what's already there and bring it out. So I would say that's how I approach things and try to keep things in balance.
When, if ever, there's been a time when someone's given you a script that you felt that would be difficult to keep in balance, what tools or what initiatives do you take to make that balance possible?
I think that often will start to evolve more in production itself, because it's interesting to see how actors will bring a different vibe. So maybe there's even a moment where I thought this isn't going to work out tonally, but the actor brings something that actually elevates it or takes it in a different direction, but it works for the story. So it's about kind of feeling it out as you go at that point, to me, when I'm on set.
Are there any times or any examples, I should say, that you can give us when an actor has actually done that?
As you know, as a filmmaker yourself, it's all about being prepared, but then on the day having to pivot. But you've kind of done all your legwork so that you can make a good decision in the moment versus, making an arbitrary choice.
That's true. So, and making a good decision in the moment is something that happens very, very often. You have to do that. And when you have to make these decisions in the moment, how often does your crew play part in this decision, in the decision process that you'd have to make?
I would say that, my DP and I have had a lot of conversations before we ever arrive on set. So, we're talking through the visual language of the film and why. And so we've had all these conversations so that when we are on set and inevitably you have to pivot, we don't have to get into a deep discussion about our options. It's like, clearly there's only one choice here because we know why we were going to do X, Y, and Z. And now because of some sort of, something that happened, we have to pivot. We can typically make that choice really quickly. So, obviously the DP would be included in that. And typically the rest of the crew will follow suit, but they're not necessarily involved in that deeper conversation that the DP and I have had ever before stepping on set, if that makes sense.
Certainly. It's glad to hear that. It sounds like you have great relationships with your DP and you're able to move forward in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important. I think pre-production is so, so important. in a way, the goal is to make the film before we ever get on set so that we're not wasting anyone's time. We're patient. We're really about going after the story and getting what we know we need to get. To me, the time to making those creative decisions and understanding the story is not day one of shooting. you know,
Yeah, I completely understand that. Definitely. And you've expressed a strong penchant for exploring emotional transformation through physical crisis in your work. Why is this?
I love exploring transformation of a character through a crisis in the body. I think it's probably because personally, that's something I can relate to in my own life, just coming to understand my own self and my own story through crisis, through a struggle. And I have a lot of questions around that personally that I think I will always have. And so, in many ways, as a filmmaker, I'm pursuing answers to those questions. And I can do that through story, and particularly this idea of how can transformation happen through a crisis in the body? How can something good come out of something that maybe at first seems like a bad thing, or certainly a suffering or some sort of tragedy? How can something good come out of that? And I'm kind of beguiled by that idea, and I think that is what always pulls me into any story. And I think that's why I'll always be a filmmaker, is because I'm pursuing my own answers to that specifically.
Why do you think you're looking for these answers?
For my own sense of meaning, for my own sense of understanding my own story, I think. Um, and yeah, we might get into more of that later, but yeah, I think it's definitely personal.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay, sure. That's understandable, and it's interesting for me
Mhm.
because I've been doing this podcast for a while now, um, nearly approaching 200 episodes. I hope I get there, and no one's answered a question like that. It's not come up
Hmm.
throughout the history of the podcast, so I'm fascinated to learn more
Yeah.
when we get there. And
Perfect.
your award-winning short film Unbound it skillfully adapts Karen Russell's story. What attracted you to this particular tale, and what challenges did you face in bringing it to the screen?
Well, when I read her short story, to me, it was just so visually evocative. I just thought this has to be a film. Um, like I didn't have a choice not to make it almost. It was that powerful to me visually. It just spoke to me. I was seeing things as I'm reading it. And as far as the challenges I experienced making it, I think as any filmmaker, every film is a challenge. You're basically just a problem solver, right? You solve one
Mm.
problem, then the next and the next. Um, for this particular film, I was part of AFI's directing workshop for women. And as part of that program, there are a lot of parameters they put on you, like a budget cap. You have to raise your budget, but you can't go over a certain amount. And for this story, being that it was a, fantasy, magical realism, historical piece, I've got turn of the century Japan, women working in a silk factory who they themselves are turning into silkworm moths. Um, there was a lot of uh, set design, costume design, special effects, makeup, VFX, working with animal wranglers for like the actual silkworms that I had on set. All of these things were challenges, but I kind of feed on that sort of a thing. So it was really fun to try to make all that work and bring a great team together to accomplish the vision. And definitely Karen Russell's story was an inspiration. I did rewrite the story. Obviously, when you adapt anything, it's going to change. But I also, as we were speaking earlier about how attracted I am to this idea of transformation through a crisis in the body, this story was very ripe for exploring that sort of idea. You have women transforming into silkworm mouths, like an actual physical transformation, this idea of metamorphosis. So that really was challenging, but just really fun to explore. And I leaned into that thematically more so than it is in the written text of the actual story. So I ended, it's actually very different than the story, the way they end. That it's quite different, but that's part of being a filmmaker. You get to interpret that stuff, and it was really fun to do.
And assembling a crew for a project like this, how do you go about doing it?
I had a really good producer, and one of the things I loved about working with him is that he would reach out to people who maybe were out of reach in a way. Like they shouldn't have said yes to being on the project because A, the budget wasn't there to afford them, or yeah, really, that was probably the main thing, but they had great talent. So sometimes it would be a question of like, hey, we know you wouldn't be able to come on board, but who could you recommend? And sometimes that person would be like, well, I'm just intrigued by the story and I love that this is supporting female director and, it's part of AFI. So I'd love to come on board. So kind of leveraging all of that to find a great team.
Excellent. And these team members or crew members, are they someone you've worked with since?
Yes, not all of them, but many of them. Yes.
Oh, excellent. It's
Mhm.
always good when you can work on a project and then move on to work on another project with one or two or three or four, if you're lucky, people that you previously worked with.
I agree because it takes being on any film set. You learn so much about each other. You start to learn a shorthand.
Mhm.
And so you've done all this groundbreaking together. So it does make sense to keep building on that with other projects for sure.
And with Brawling Love set to release this year, can you
Mhm.
give us a sneak peek into the magical realism elements you've incorporated and the significance they hold within the storyline?
Sure. So this will be a little bit of a spoiler because there's really only one scene that is magical realism. And it's so fun. It's really the climax of the movie. The premise of the movie is that you've got two rivals, a guy and a girl who've known each other since childhood, it's a high school rom-com. They're looking to win the prize of being the best actor in this performance of Romeo and Juliet. And one of them obviously plays Romeo and the other Juliet. The whole play is set in an underwater world. So the character of Romeo is an alligator and the character of Juliet is a goldfish. At the climax of the film, we actually go into this other world where the lead characters Romeo becomes this alligator and Juliet becomes this goldfish, and they are struggling up the opposite sides of this aquarium volcano to meet at the top. So, yeah, it's definitely a visual metaphor. It was really fun to kind of build this whole different world for that scene that really tracks the emotional journey of our characters as well.
That's amazing. So
Yeah.
what exactly, other than the magical realism in that scene and the premise of it itself, attracted you to direct this project? Because in London or in the UK, as far as I'm concerned, we're not really seeing many rom-coms anymore like we used to.
I think it's a genre that's very intriguing to me. I don't think that's unique to the UK. I think, with the exception of like, hey, the Christmas rom-coms that are very
Mm.
popular now on all the platforms, I feel a need for it to come back. I feel like people like them.
Mm.
I do. I really like rom-coms. My very first, well, not my first, but one of my first narrative short films was a rom-com, and I just have always loved that genre. So, and I like you have noted, I love magical realism. So it just kind of seemed like a really fun world to explore.
It really does. I can't wait for your one to come out.
Thank you.
I'm always interested in seeing more, that's for sure.
Yes.
Historically, fiction and fantasy seem to be genres you're quite fond of. What draws you to these genres, and how do you approach world building within them?
I think what attracts me to those genres is the world building. Like it's not like you just show up and you can you're in the normal world. We're taking an audience to a place they don't know. Maybe they knew it. Maybe if it's recent history, there's a nostalgia there that you can kind of tap into. If it's history that's further out, you really have a lot of freedom to be creative and build that world. And for me, often when I'm thinking of a story or I've read a script that I didn't write, or some piece of material that I'm creating a movie from, it's a visual image that'll come to me, and that it'll be like an image that hits me, and that is kind of my way into the story and my way into the world building.
I see. Wow,
Hmm.
very interested. World building is very, very good. And I see what you mean, because if you do something from, let's say, the 90s, it's easier to make a mistake, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, but if you go way back to maybe the 40s, there's less eyes on the film that would even remember or have interest to know what the 40s was exactly like in that way. Your upcoming feature, Say It in German, is
Yes.
based on real world events during World War II. What inspired you to tell this story?
So I am a hired, they hired me as the director for this story. I did not write the script. I know the producer I grew up in a very small town in central Illinois, and the producer is from that town as well, but she's a well-known actress as well. So it's
Yeah.
her story of her family. So
Oh.
she had this script written. It's kind of the history of what her father through as a boy, growing up during World War II as a German in America. And it's a pretty powerful story. I also think it's relevant to us today because there's this whole storyline about the father who gets sick and has to be quarantined away from the family. And it just reminds me a lot about what some of us had to go through during COVID, But there's a lot of, it's definitely a family story. I have some nostalgia connected to it just because I know the area that it actually took place in. They're going to film it. We'll be filming it there as well. So it's kind of like going back to my roots in a way and connecting with people, other artists that I really respect, that I've never had a chance to work with this producer actress before, even though I've known her for many, many years. So I'm really looking forward to bringing my skill set to the story.
Excellent. And what do you think about your skill set
Mm-hmm.
would separate you from any other potential director that could have directed the film?
For this particular film, I do think having been born and raised in that area where the story was also truly happened, brings me a certain awareness that maybe someone else might not have from the outside. Just knowing that world very much because it's where I grew up, I think is going to bring a huge, outside of just my skills as a director, I would say for that personal connection is really important. It's going to add a texture to the film that wouldn't be there otherwise.
And where you grew up, was that a hotbed for creative talent?
No. Oh my gosh. I grew up in a town of 2,500 people. I
Wow.
literally had a cornfield next to me.
Oh.
That was our next door neighbors. It's a cornfield. No, very small. In fact, I never thought of being a filmmaker because I thought that's for people that come from other places. I never saw anyone in town doing that stuff. However, I grew up in a very creative family. My stepfather was a musician, and my parents put just as much, if not more, importance on the arts, rather than the academics. That, if we didn't come home with an A in math, it was not the end of the world. It was like the art classes were just as important. And I'm really grateful for that because
I'm so happy for you.
yeah, I think it was a rare experience, to be honest. And we were a little bit weird because, we didn't have a conventional lifestyle in that sense, of my father being a musician and everything. And my mom was so good. I would say all the seeds for me being a filmmaker were planted as in my childhood because my mom was this amazing, she would read us books and she could do all these great voices, and she was just a great storyteller. And also in our family, we would have family night, movie nights where we would watch all the classics. Like we would watch Hitchcock, we would watch Fellini films, we would watch the musicals, all of this this was my education, I think, without knowing it. Charlie Chaplin, all these sort of classic things that I was exposed to. And, I started my journey as an actor. I studied acting. I was in theater. I did a one-woman show for 4 years where I toured all over the country, and into Europe a little bit and also Canada. And then after that, I got into painting and photography, did like wedding photography and portraiture. And I just, through this journey, started to think maybe I need to go back to school. Maybe I need to study film. Yeah, I think I was just discovering maybe there would be something there. And I went to film school thinking I was going to be a producer because I'm very type A and I like, organizing things. But it was pretty immediately clear to me after I took my first directing class that was where all my loves converged because, I had studied acting, so I knew that language. I had worked painting, very specific discipline of painting that I studied, along with photography. So I was learning, what is the geometry of the frame? What do colors mean? Even what gestures mean? And I also would write as well. So these things all kind of came together in directing. And I realized, wow, I think in my journey as a creative, I had to go through all these steps to get to the point where I was equipped, to where my eye was trained, to be a good storyteller as a director. So, yeah, that that's my long-winded answer to to whatever the question was that I don't even remember now.
No, that is your great answer to the question that was about how do you feel you can direct this, bring in a different set of skills basically to anyone else. And you answered that clearly. I love the fact that you went into photography, something I've done myself, and I've shot weddings as a videographer, not as a photographer. Something I just kind of had to do, in all honesty, just to kind of put some money in the bank for
Yep.
a period of time. And it sounds like you had a really great upbringing that has influenced you, and it's so nice that you had those movie nights and things like that, and you can, as a family, share the experience of watching films, because the experience watching films can be so social, obviously, when we go to theaters to watch movies. So you had that from an early age, and it's helped develop and make you what you are today.
Yeah.
Considering your extensive experience in both narrative film and commercial productions, what difference do you find in your creative process when tackling projects for various mediums?
I want to say that I'm really grateful that I get to work in these different mediums, because there's variety is a spice of life. It really
Mm.
is fun to kind of exercise different muscles in these different spaces. Oftentimes, when I'm working in a narrative project, I get to be the visionary. I get to be the one who's leading the team, getting to say, this is what we're going for, this is how we're going to achieve it. And although that's somewhat true in the commercial space, the difference is that I am serving the vision of a client, of a
Mm.
brand. So I don't have free range. It's not like the Wild West where I get to figure, it's very much checking with that client, making sure. Sometimes it means I have to help them figure out what their vision is. And I mean, oftentimes that's part of it. But I really am. If it's just me working on the narrative with a team, it's serving the story. If it's me working for a client, it's serving the client through whatever story they've chosen, for me to tell it through. I would say that's a big difference.
Because for a lot of us, working with clients is something we do to pay the bills.
Mhm.
And then there's like the narrative stuff, the short films or the feature films that we really enjoy and love working in. Is
Mhm.
there a particular client that you worked for that you really enjoyed and it didn't feel like maybe it was something you kind of had to do, in inverted commas?
Yeah. I've done a number of things with Bank of America, which when you hear like, oh, bank working for a bank, that sounds so boring. Like, why would you even like, I don't know. But what I have liked about some of the projects I've done with them is that they have these small business commercials that feature a small business owner that truly banks with them. So one of my skill sets and one of my loves as a filmmaker is doing like mini documentaries, getting to know real people and what their journey is. And I get to do that for these commercials. And I love talking to entrepreneurs, because I find I'm an entrepreneur, as any filmmaker is. And I think it takes a lot of tenacity to be an entrepreneur. So I always
Mm.
learn something, and I love to learn about their grit story, like it's not easy. So like, what is your passion that's gotten you through all the hard times? So those have been lovely moments where I get to discover a person in the context of, they happen to bank with this bank, but it's really a personal story, about how they've been able to make their business a reality. And so those have been quite enjoyable.
Being a freelancer has its ups and downs. It certainly is you're certainly in a situation where you're not guaranteed a certain check at the end of the month, or a certain security, or certain even mental state that maybe working 9 to 5 that can offer people. Why do you take these risks and uncertainty to be a filmmaker?
Because I can't get away from it. I mean, let me tell you, Damien, for many, many, many years, it's been the filmmaking stuff is the side hustle. And then I have some job that's paying the bills, you know?
Okay.
That's not the case now, and I'm grateful for that. But I don't take it for granted
Yeah.
because, you know, yeah, but I can't like I can't not I love being a filmmaker. I am in my flow state when I am on set or prepping or writing. So I can't imagine being fulfilled if I weren't doing those things. And that's why I do it, even though there's great risk involved. Absolutely. But I also love being on a path of growth. I love learning. And I feel like being an entrepreneur is very much about that. You know, you are always on a path of growth, you are learning. Um, and that keeps me very engaged. I love the diversity of that from day to day.
A path of growth. I love it. Always learning. I love
Mhm.
it. I love it. Given your success writing, directing, and producing content across different platforms, how do you prioritize projects, and what criteria do you use to select your next venture?
Yeah, I love that question. You know, at times in the past, the priority can be very practical. I need to pay the bills, so I will
Mm.
take that job. You know, and sometimes it's that, and oftentimes one of my kind of discernment tools is, is there something about this that draws me? Is
Yeah,
it a brand or a story or, you know, a person that I'd like to collaborate with? Um, and I let that guide me, you know? Um, and sometimes, like recently this summer, I shot a proof of concept TV pilot. And that was very strategic for me. It was a story I really wanted to tell, but it came with a lot of sacrifice. I had to say no to other very lucrative jobs in
yeah,
order to be available to do that. And it didn't pay well, but I did it knowing that I love the story. I want to work with these people, and it will most likely lead to a series that, you know, I can be a part of. So every job is unique. I will say more and more, I'm leaning into this idea. I have it up on my board. It says go for no. I want to say no more than I say yes, because that means that I have a sense of, you know, what works for me, what are things that I feel are valuable for me to tell, you know, story is valuable for me to tell. um and not to be afraid of saying no, not to have a scarcity mentality of like, if I say no to this, then I might not get X, Y, and Z. If something's not a good fit for me, it's better for me to say no because it's a good fit for someone else, you know? And so get out of the way for that other person to do it. And the right thing will come my way. Either I create the right thing or it'll come to me from, you know, some other entity or person.
that's fair. What would you say makes a good collaborator for you?
Wow, I love that question. I think a good collaborator for me is someone who has maybe different skill sets than myself. Um Someone that has, in a way, some thick skin, because I feel like in the creative process, especially when maybe you're figuring out a story, if you're in the writing process especially, or even in the editing process, like, you have to be able to say you have to have an opinion, you
Mm,
know what I mean? And, sometimes opinions differ, and so you just gotta fight for the best story together and move on and not take anything personally. It's like, we're on this journey together, we're a team, we're trying to figure this out together. So really having that kind of sense of teammate. Um, yeah, and then someone who brings other skills to the table that I don't have or don't want to spend my time on, because they're just not my gifts or whatever. I just don't love doing those things. And probably the story itself. You know, like I want to make sure that if I'm attached to a story that I'm passionate about, I definitely want the other person or people, the collaborators, to have that same love for the story, you know?
that makes sense.
Mhm.
So, as someone who has developed meaningful branded content for a range of clients, can you discuss the importance of authenticity in storytelling when crafting narratives for brands?
Yeah, you know, I think oftentimes the work I'm doing for branded contents will involve real people on camera talking about their story in some way. And so it's already kind of baked into the authenticity, in a way, is sort of baked into the project. However, there is a skill to bringing, especially when you're working with people who are not familiar with being in front of the camera, and they're sharing their story. It takes some skill to help someone feel comfortable in front of the camera, and asking great interview questions like you're so good at doing. Yeah, really, you're very gifted. And I think it's very important for me when I'm working in this realm to let the person know that they're in charge of their story. Like, we're not going to go in a direction they don't want to go. And that tends to bring a comfort and an ease that shows up on camera, and it translates into authenticity. So, yeah, I would say in some ways it's already baked in, and in other ways I also have to draw it out.
Excellent. I'm sure a lot of people listening can learn from that answer. That is for sure. And having worked under mentorship programs and initiatives like A&E's Broad Focus and Ryan Murphy's Half Initiative,
Mhm.
what invaluable lessons did you learn that helped shape your directional approach?
I don't know that I can say that those programs shaped my approach as a director, but what I can say is the value of those programs is you're meeting people and entities that maybe you wouldn't otherwise meet. And hopefully you're working with people that are better than myself, better than you in the craft, so that you can learn and grow. I always want to be in the room with people that are smarter than me, that are better than me, because otherwise, I want to grow. Like I said, I'm always on a path of growth. I want to learn. So put me in the room with people who I can glean great, craftsmanship from. And the other value, I think, having been in so many of these different programs, is it teaches flexibility, like adaptability, because every program or every TV show I've ever shadowed on or been on, they all have their different flavor, their different personality, their different way of doing things. So it's not like everything is going to be applicable to the next show you're on, or the next program you're in, or the next thing. So the takeaway really is to be flexible, to be adaptable and nimble. And I think that is applicable to any directing situation I'm in. And those have been great. It's been great to learn that.
Excellent. And you're actively involved in creating television pilots, which I love watching. Slightly going off topic, the first one I bought television pilot was of a show called Quantum Leap on
Okay.
VHS. And
I
I was
love
like, wow. Because the thing that makes me excited about pilots is the pilot is different from the first episode that officially comes out. So I always like to go back and see a pilot. Another one I love is My So-Called Life. I don't know if you remember that show.
definitely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the pilot, and then there's the first episode. So I'm a big fan of pilots, hence this question. So I'll start again. You're actively involved in creating television pilots with a focus on historical female-driven stories. In your writing process for TV, how do you condense expansive stories into episodic formats that keep audience engaged?
So I will say, I feel like even though I have been working, writing and I worked on a television show. I was the assistant to the creators of the show Grimm on NBC. So I've been in the writer's room and, um, well acclimated to that space of TV. But I still feel like I have a lot of room to grow. So I will not pretend like I have any sort of huge word of wisdom to give in this respect. But I will say that for me, structure is very important. Structure is kind of my true north that I go back to help me stay, how do I corral all these big historical ideas and then these character moments that are quite personal, and how do you combine those? And I find that structure is the thing that I can keep going back to. That's like my training wheels, or they corral the ideas, right? And it gives it a sense of momentum and story. But I feel that rewriting is my constant bane in life. And I, try to do anything I can to postpone the rewrite, just because I find it just, once I'm in there, it's great. But I really struggle with kind of the momentum of getting in the room and writing.
When you say, when you say the momentum of getting in the room and rewriting, what do you mean? Is that the mental space, or?
I think it's just resistance. And I think this is something that I've really had to, and I still work on it, but I've had to do a lot of work around of just being able to even claim the title of writer, even though I've written a lot. I don't know. Yeah, it's been interesting to work through psychologically. Why do I bump on that? Why do I, because when I am writing, I do get into a flow state and I really enjoy it, but I just find that I have a lot of resistance leading up to it. And so writers groups have been helpful to me as far as having support I can bounce ideas off of, and, not be solo in the room working on these things at times. And I've gotten some grants to do writing, and that also has involved being a part of some sort of brain trust, which has been great. So those are helpful, support systems as I go about it. But just being completely honest, I find a lot of resistance when I go back into the rewrite.
In these support groups, it's great that you're getting support and you can bounce ideas and people are willing to help and encourage. I think we all need that. In times when people are unable to work out their own ideas on a piece of paper and put their own structure together for a screenplay, how do you help them, and what do you say to encourage people?
Well, I'm pretty intuitive. Like when I'm reading someone else's story, and I've read a lot of stories and written a lot of coverage, especially because when I worked in television, you do a lot of that. You're reading a lot of scripts. And so, I've learned a lot about writing through that, reading other people's work. So my notes are pretty intuitive. I like to be really encouraging. I like to call out what I see that I think is working well. And then I like to be more broad. I don't like to get into the weeds of, this line is a little bit wonky. Why don't you try it this way? I don't think that's helpful. It's not helpful to me. I mean, it doesn't, if someone wants to say, hey, maybe work on the dialogue of the scene, that's helpful, but not like the nitpicky thing, And I think the other piece that I try to do is really understand what the writer is trying to go for, so that I can give them feedback on, I think what you're going for is coming through, and you could bring up the volume up on that by doing X, Y, and Z potentially. Or if that's what you're going for, it's not really coming through. You know what I mean? Because sometimes we can give notes, and I've seen it done so many times, where people are giving notes to someone and it's like, that's the note giver's vision of the story. It's not the writer's vision of the story. So how can we help the writer, support them to find the thing they're trying to find and to write the thing they're trying to write, versus impose, let's take it in a totally different direction because that's my whim, So it's trying to be really respectful of the person and their story.
Excellent. I really, really like that answer. And finally, Say It German is something that sounds like professionally and personally is possibly quite close to your heart, considering where it's going to be shot and who the film was produced by. What are your expectations for the project, and what would really make you happy once the film is finished completely and out there for the world to see?
Might sound a little, maybe not the answer you're expecting, but in some ways I hope it inspires little young filmmakers like I was, who didn't know people could make films because I came from this little town in the middle of nowhere. I thought that was for people from big cities. I'm hoping it inspires just other creatives to realize that there are lots of, like, they don't have to tell themselves no. They can explore all the things. They would get to it quicker in life than I did. It took me a while to get there, So that would be amazing. And I think it's a beautiful story about a family who really comes together in a time of crisis. And I hope that in a perfect world, that would inspire people, would give people hope, especially maybe families that are struggling with things like, in this case, it was illness that was separating family members. And also culturally, there were a lot of bias going on at that time. And this family was really persecuted unfairly. And so just being aware, maybe an awareness of bias that we have, and we can put people in a box without really knowing them or their story, and it's not fair. So hopefully it'll open a door for us to see each other as humans, not as descriptors.
Completely. Maggie, you certainly inspired the listeners of Filmmaking Conversations today. So thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you, Damien. I appreciate it. It was great to be here.
Have you thought of upgrading your cinematography game? Would you like to have an ASC cinematographer mentor you for free? Join veteran cinematographer Suki Medenzovic, ASC, Disney, Pixar, FX Networks, Netflix, American Horror Story. As he teaches you how to create beautiful images using 3 lighting techniques he has mastered on film sets over his 30-plus years in the film industry. Each technique uses basic, low-cost lighting equipment so that anyone can achieve beautiful visuals no matter your project's budget. If you want to take your cinematography to the next level, visit filmmakingconversations.com to sign up for instant access. If you like this podcast, share it with friends, leave a comment in the comments section, and hit the subscribe button. If you like this podcast, share it with friends, leave a comment in the comments section, and hit the subscribe button.